All right, my name is Mike Vandenhoevel. I'm the director of the Canadian Rivers Institute. And I'm going to introduce the Hynes Lecture Series to you, followed by Donald Baird with the Canadian Rivers Institute, who's going to introduce our esteemed speaker. The Hynes Lecture Series was started by the Canadian Rivers Institute in 2002 with the awarding of an honorary doctorate to Noel Hynes. Noel is often known as the father of running water ecology. He started his career in the UK in the 50s. Although he often considered himself to be an entomologist gone wrong, in that he switched to the study of aquatic insects from agricultural pests, which at the time wasn't a very common thing. He published in 1960 already the Biology of Polluted Water, which was decades ahead of its time in terms of our understanding of the impacts of humans on the freshwater environment. He moved to the University of Waterloo in 1964 to become the first director of the biology department there. A few years later, he published the Ecology of Running Waters, which is still considered to be the Bible of running waters, and again, introduced concepts that we use to this day with regard to running water. Each year, the science directors of the CRI meet to review the contributions of leading freshwater ecologists in the world. And select a recipient who exemplifies the science and contributions of Dr. Hynes. We've had the privilege of hosting many top scientists in freshwater ecology. Donald will introduce our speaker for this year. Typically the Hynes Lecture is a series of science lectures, one in St. John this morning and one tomorrow, and this one which is the public lecture. Without further ado, Donald.
Thank you very much, Mike. It gives me great pleasure tonight to introduce this year's Hynes Lecture speaker, Dr. Julian Olton. After growing up on a sailboat on the waters of Lake Ontario, according to his biography, Dr. Julian Olton obtained his BSc and his master's degree from the University of Toronto. And then he studied at Colorado State University, where he obtained his PhD in 2004 in the lab of a previous Hynes lecturer, Dr. Leroy Clough, who gave the Hynes lectures here several years ago. This was followed by a postdoctoral stint at the University of Wisconsin in Madison, supported by a David H. Smith Postdoctoral Fellowship Award. And he finally settled at the University of Washington in Seattle, also the host university of our last Hynes lecturer, Christian Torgerson, where he's currently an associate professor in the School of Aquatic and Fishery Science, with a burgeoning complement of graduate students and postdocs with an international research focus. His career publications so far number over 220, with over 100 published in the last 5 years, which is any standards. Certainly puts me to shame, that's for sure. A prodigious output for such a young researcher. He's an in-demand speaker at international conferences, with a passion equally divided between communication of his cutting-edge research and together with his students, saving the world one fish at a time. Julian's research spans continents, and current work in his lab involves collaborative research with scientists in Australia, Amazonia, and North America. His list of awards is equally impressive and includes an Early Career Conservationist Award from the Society of Conservation Biology, an Outstanding Researcher Award from the University of Wisconsin College of the Environment, a Stevenson Award from Canadian Conference for Fisheries Research, the Mason Keeler Endowed Professor. He's currently Mason Keeler Endowed Professor at the University of University of Washington, School of Aquatic and Fisheries Sciences. He's an Early Career Fellow of the Ecological Society of America, and an Aldo Leopold Leadership Fellow at the Stanford Woods Institute of the Environment. Key recurrent themes in his work include fisheries conservation and the role played by invasive species in aquatic ecosystems, but Julian's also promoted the need to improve science communication, highlighted in his most recent paper, which is an opinion article in Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, which deals with the need for scientists to produce lay summaries of their work in order to better communicate their science to the public. In this paper, he and his co-author, Lauren Kuhn, make a plea for scientists to learn the essential skill of distilling the essence of their published work in the form of lay science summaries. At a time when the need for science communication is more important than ever, I'm confident that he'll provide a masterclass to us all this evening in his presentation, which is titled Invasive Species, Staying the Course, or Exonerating Crimes to Envision a New People.
Thank you, Donald, for that. Thank you, Karen, and the entire selection committee for having me here. Being spoken in the same breath of Noel Hynes is quite a pleasure. I was reviewing the book with Johnny Waters, graduate student at the University of Toronto. I said this earlier today, but looking back at the list of speakers at our Hynes lectures have been here is quite humbling. Many of the people that I look up to and continue to look up to, so either the selection committee made a good choice, or either way, you're here for an hour, so what the hell, right? But really, it's definitely my pleasure to be here. This is, I know I'm going to look back at this just as really memorable, and I look forward to the next couple of days. So I still have my voice after a long day, so I wanted to talk a little bit about how we envision the world, if you will, and talk a little bit about how kind of our discourse on invasive species will have changed a lot over the last 5 years, and talk about how collectively as a society we can think about how we envision non-native species in the future. So, I couldn't talk about non-native species if I didn't show kind of the snakehead photo. And then indeed, this has different connotations for different people. The movie such as this Really Bad Kill alt movie, really highlights the point in terms of society, in terms of the dual nature in which we view these species. So to many of us, when we think about the natural world, we think about national parks, scenic rivers, provincial parks, and this kind of exemplifies beauty. Today, my simple point is that the world we live in is very, very different. All of us, we take a big, deep breath in. That air has about 36% more molecules of carbon dioxide than it did a mere 200 years ago. Right? Human footprint is massive. There's some really stunning examples in wildlife which highlights this. For example, during the housing crisis in the United States, bobcats took up residence in foreclosed homes in LA. Moose have their young in parking lots of Walmart to protect themselves from bears, which are afraid of humans. What about the northern mockingbird? That's complex vocal callbacks to car alarms. And what about the largest colony of bats, the Mexican free-winged bats, under a single bridge in Austin, Texas? And of course, an increasing number of birds that use cigarette butts in their nest because the nicotine actually doesn't favor parasites. So they're actually parasite-free with young. Right? So these are all about the simple fact that the world is obviously quite different. So the question is, there's aliens among us. Does it really matter? This is a great quote from the National Safety Foundation. This is the same council, that is responsible for seatbelt laws in the United States. And they had this quote that the United States is having issues with aliens, not alien immigrants or space invaders, I'm not worried, but the plants and animals that reach our shores instead. Right, this is a very large issue. And really on the shoulders of humans, non-native species have been dispersed around the world. This is shipping patterns across the world. And we know that ballast water in the Great Lakes is a great example of it, is a very large important vector of non-native species. We see the pet aquarium trade, horticulture trade. There's all these mechanisms by which we have moved organisms around. And even the mechanisms of, say, tsunami debris that basically dislodged human infrastructure, which then crossed the Pacific Ocean and landed on the shores of Washington State and Oregon. Now, there's certain non-native species that are really emblematic, I think, of the impacts that they do have. So, for example, we can look at kudzu, also called the vine that ate the South, right? This is native to southern Japan, Southeast China. Basically, it was introduced as an ornamental plant back in the 1870s. And now it occupies about 7 million acres across the southeast and grows up to 60 feet per year. This poor guy's Honda Civic will not be found for a while. What about the brown tree snake, right? The snake that ate Guam. Got introduced because of airline traffic during the Second World War. Now basically consumed its way through most of the native birds there. And actually costs millions of dollars in economic damages because it falls out of trees and drapes over power lines and causes blackouts. What about dead man's finger? A Pacific algal species that ranges from Maine all the way up to Nova Scotia into the Bay of Fundy. Carpets many of marine coastal regions shown here and blankets out many non-native species. And the European starling, we can't remember that. Introduction first because from a Shakespeare lover into Central Park. He wanted to introduce all of the birds which were in all of Shakespeare's plays. He started with the European starling of about 40 birds. Now it occupies all of the United States and parts of Canada. They form these massive swarms, which actually cause airline traffic issues by running into planes. And if you squint really hard, I'm pretty sure it's giving all of us the middle finger. Chlorpa, the killer algae, is another great example, an aquarium release, which has been a very large issue. Yellow crazy ant, I love these names. Right? Introduced on a Christmas Island, they release acid when disturbed. And it's kind of a loss of an endemic crab species on Easter Island. Over a third of their populations as they migrate down and the mountains down to the coastal systems, crawl over these ants and then die because of the acidification. And we cannot finish this discussion with one of my favorite, rock snot. Basically, this is a diatom species and can completely overgrow benthos areas and running waters. So these are all very strong poster men and women of the invasive species world, right? These are the organisms which get our attention in the public media. These are the examples on why we call non-native species often having high impacts when they're invasive. But not all non-native species are problems, right? And not all problematic species are non-native. So let's take a look at this just for 1 second. Increasing evidence suggests that there's strong conservation value of many non-native species in highly altered environments. For example, the red swamp crayfish is an important prey species for endangered birds in Spain. They provide food. They also provide many important ecosystem services. Non-native birds now pollinate many, many crops across the United States, right? The European bee, if it wasn't for that, we would not have a modern day agricultural system in North America. They're also the catalyst for restoration in some areas. Even the zebra mussel has been used in parts of Europe to basically clean up toxic waters before then other restoration activities can be used by reintroducing fish. So there's these examples of flip sides of stories. Invasive species or non-natives, which are in fact not always bad. And in many cases, these species are there because they're favored in highly disturbed environments, the exact habitats that humans have created, right? So it's not that it's a good thing because of replacing natives. Natives can do the same function, but the environments aren't supporting the natives anymore. So my simple point here is that, again, not all non-native species are bad, and not all problematic species are non-native. For example, there's this emerging idea that many native species are acting as invaders. They're reaching high enough abundances that they're nuisance species in their habitat. For example, in the Columbia River system, this is the northern pike minnow. This is a native fish, now is reaching high abundances and is consuming many Pacific salmon. There's a bounty program out for this fish now. The government spends about $1.5 million to pad the pockets of fishermen, to pay them between $5 to $8 a fish to remove them out of the Columbia River, with the idea that that reduces predation on juvenile out-migrating salmon. These Caspian terns, harbor seals, all native species that happen to consume something that we value, salmon, and now are considered non-native in some ways, at least the way in which we treat them. And then there's these kind of really interesting situations where we're profiting from non-natives and we'll actually control or cull natives because they threaten them. Areas of South America where native species. Llamas are actually culled because they're competing with non-native deer. And deer provide a lot of economic incentives for hunters coming in. So there's lots of paradoxical twists, I will, in terms of this non-native bad, native good. I would contend that actually invasive species was something that we could call a wicked problem. It's wicked because they, quote, are a challenge that are difficult or impossible to solve due to incomplete, contradictory, and changing requirements that are often tough to recognize. So wicked problems are largely because of big-time social and cultural values preclude adequate solutions to all stakeholders. People have different opinions on invasive and non-native species. So the fact that it's nested within this social complex environment, and that makes it very difficult to try to understand what the best solutions are. So this is a term that's been around for quite a while. And actually one of the kind of criteria for something being wicked is that you don't understand the problem until you've actually developed a solution. So the simple fact that the goalposts are always changing. What looked as being good in idea in terms of, say, controlling non-native species is actually quite bad. Right? Or non-native species, which used to be bad, is actually quite good in, say, highly altered systems. So every solution exposes basically new problems. So let's take a look at a couple examples of that to convince you, if I may, that invasive species are what we consider a wicked problem. So let's take a look at salt cedar, for example, tamarisk. So many of these tree and shrub species were introduced from Eurasia, mainly into the western part of the United States. This was basically after the Dust Bowl. This was all about basically stabilizing soils. So they were introduced all the way around. Aldo Leopold had tamarisk in his backyard. He had a totally different view of this non-native. But views change, right? So tamarisk now is basically throughout most of the West. They would argue that it's having huge economic damages. It has tap roots. It goes into the water column. So it extracts water out. It outcompetes cottonwood and willow, which are native species of the region. It sheds its leaves, which are high in salt content and which other plants can't establish. So there's this big push to control tamarisk. And in fact, biocontrol, if anyone has ever heard of that before, it's a very interesting situation is that if you want to control a non-native species, you introduce another non-native species to control it. My dad at a very young age told me that two wrongs typically never make a right. Now, in all reality, there's been some very high success stories of biocontrol, particularly with agricultural pests. And there's a long history of biocontrol. And if we look at salt cedar, there's actually a release of the tamarisk beetle. The beetle which forages upon tamarisk and was released to try to control them. This is just a map showing from 2007 in red, initial introductions, and this is kind of spread over time of this beetle through, I don't know how many states, but that's a big chunk of land. Now in 2010, they came to the realization that there's actually some benefits of salt cedar that really they weren't thinking that much about. Now salt cedar comes in, they outcompete cottonwood and willow, and unfortunately there happens to be an ESA, endangered species, listed as the willow flycatcher. This is a species that was known just to reproduce and occupy willow, but in fact had taken up in salt cedar. And in fact, the bulk of their occupancy now are in tamarisk, salt cedar. So again, a potential solution reveals additional problems. And now there's a lot of places where they're trying to slow the beetle spread so it doesn't wipe out tamarisk. The invasivore's dilemma, right? Well, if we can't beat them, let's join them, right? Let's eat non-native species. Many of you have probably heard about the lionfish invasion, right? Potentially a release from an aquarium during a hurricane. I forget the name of the hurricane in '92. Released individuals now spread all the way down through the Caribbean, all the way down to Costa Rica. And now, obviously, there's a big bounty on them. Scuba divers go out, hunt them. And they're actually now, there's cookbooks. It's a big deal in New York City to actually eat them. There's not much meat on it, so it's kind of crazy to me. But on the other hand, I have Pacific salmon to eat every day in Seattle. So eating non-natives is actually a big thing is getting promoted all over the place. Look at Asian carp, for example. We're shipping it out to get then consumed in Southeast Asia. Now the issue is that once you put economic value on something, then there's a tendency then to try to conserve or manage in a positive way for that species. Because there's economics to it. So we can think of countless examples of other species. Snakehead is a great good example of it, which has been intentionally introduced to try to be a food. If you look in the Potomac River. And there's actually instances that they're afraid of. It's actually lionfish potentially will get moved around because now they have this economic value. So again, a solution sometimes reveals a problem. Okay, so the challenge ahead, in my opinion, is that many who oppose non-native species only recognize the few non-natives that have impacts. And those are the impacts that they've been taught. Rather than the more general public having a more deeper understanding of what non-native is and how it's distinct from invasive. And policymakers struggle over this. I mean, this is simply in ideas and perceptions. People value different things, and they struggle with that when they're thinking about something that potentially belongs versus doesn't belong. And the public perception of invasive species, I would argue, right now is an all-time high in terms of how dynamic and how diverse it is. So what's really interesting is that if something is wicked, and you times it by social complexity, that is diverse viewpoints on a single topic, that is a force of fragmentation. And that's exactly what we're seeing in terms of issues around invasive species. Because the simple fact is that the level of knowledge doesn't define our support for management and policy. We like to think that that's what scientists do. We provide a lot of knowledge, and that's going to be uptaked and then put into important policy or management, but that's actually not what we're seeing. What's more important is beliefs, values, and biases. All of those interact and flavor the way in which the public, and what I'll show you in a second, the way in which scientists feel about non-native species. So scientists like to think that we are free of biases, right? Trust me, I'm a scientist, right? But in fact, we all have our internal stereotypes, our internal value belief systems around certain organisms. And in many ways, that's flavored the discourse on non-native species that we see in the literature. Because when we look to the literature, there's been some very strong digging in of opinions over non-native species by prominent scientists everywhere, including some of them shown here. So this general notion of, what are the role of non-native species? Contribute to biological diversity. So much so, why don't we end the field of invasion biology, right? It's just a degree of effect in an ecosystem. Whether it's native or non-native doesn't really matter. That's what Mark Davis and others argue here. Don't worry, there's 141 other scientists that objected, right? And rightly so. I mean, they oversimplified the issue a little bit. But there's this debate of polarization that's going on. And although I'm slightly guilty to contributing to some of this as well, what's really interesting is that wicked problems lead to strong polarization. They lead to different camps digging in their feet. And they often lead to trying to simplify the wicked problem down to a very simple question, a simple dichotomy, bad versus good. Right? That's how we deal with wicked problems. And that's exactly how this debate has tried to deal with them. So what's really interesting is that in this argument and in this dialogue, it moved outside of the realm of science and actually got into biases. It actually got into xenophobia. Hello, to answer that call, it's probably important, right? Ask them what it was, xenophobia, right? That's the issue here, right? I'm going to bug Karen about that. Is there just a strong dislike, regardless of origin or not, right? Do scientists bring their baggage when they think about non-native species, just like the public might bring? So humans like to pass judgment, and scientists are kind of no exception. So the judgments of people are basically influenced by what is real, objectively correct, about some kind of target's behavior, so about, say, an invasive species or non-native species, right, the truth. But also about systematic biases. based on our kind of predisposed notion about what a certain species, something maybe labeled as non-native, should do or not do. Right? And again, scientists are no different. We pass judgment. We pass judgment all the time. Society passes judgment all the time on a whole variety of things. We've been struggling with people passing judgment on a whole variety of things throughout the history of this country. Now, there's two types of systematic biases, right? There's stereotypes. So, for example, an individual might have an overall negative attitude on a certain target or question, and therefore will tend to use negative terms to describe it. And that's absolutely irregardless of the behavior of that target, how they behave. And then it might take a step further in terms of what we call confirmation bias. The simple fact is that we flavor our interpretation of knowledge that's delivered to us through our preconceived stereotypes. Right? So the idea that we interpret new knowledge in a way, again, not by the knowledge that's presented to us, but the biases, the baggage that we have. So these are kind of two general types of systematic biases that we see. And in fact, there's a third one, which I won't talk about, is the backfire effect. It's really interesting literature. It's those that are really ingrained, really believe in something, they'll dig their heels in even harder when evidence is shown to contrary to what they believe in. Right? Now, we can think of examples of this. And I'll stop there. But I'd say the backfire effect is largely in effect in many ways in climate science. Okay. So let's take a look at this for a while. Why not, right? Because as scientists, we love to test this, right? You know, are scientists xenophobic? Do we have stereotypes that we impose in our work? This is something that's totally intriguing. It's something like starting with social sciences, got in psychology, since I had really no training. It's so awesome. And it got me meeting and talking to people that I thought I'd never talk to. And then let me just talk to you a little bit about the results of the study, if you will. So I haven't published, but I thought I'd share with you. So the question is, how do ecologists judge non-native species? So how do they judge non-natives? By quantifying kind of these are potential effects of systematic biases that are associated with just the native status of a species. So questions, do stereotypes affect attitudes towards non-natives? And is there evidence for this confirmation bias among scientists? And are biases stronger or weaker for what we call invasion biologists, those that study invasive species? Okay. So to do this, I conducted an expert survey. After conferring with a lot of people, basically, the subject population was the leading authors of 20 leading ecology and conservation journals over the last 5 years. So this was, I sent out a survey link to about 12,000 people to conduct this survey. This is about 2,000 of them responded, which actually is a phenomenal return rate for surveys. So I was actually quite happy. And this was the distribution of respondents around the world. So I'm speaking to hopefully global ecologists. Whole variety of questions were asked, which I'll get to in a second. But important is that the subjects just demonstrated different varies of degrees in expert invasion biology. So I asked them what % of their research is on invasion biology. I asked them a bunch of questions. And this is kind of a histogram of the % of subjects who said none of their research is invasion biology versus some %. So for this study, I'm just simply going to say ecologists are those that have 0%. And anything that has, anyone's ever published anything in invasion biology, I'm going to call those invasion biologists, okay? And I looked at this more closely. It's all good, however I cut it up, okay? But those are my two groups, let's just say. So how do we get at these biases? So there's been a really, again, because of the severe amount of stereotypes that exist in human society, there's been a whole variety of kind of different approaches to try to get at this. There's a classic approach in the 1960s in which we wanted to know whether the perceived socioeconomic status of a child would flavor the way in which a teacher thought that he or she would perform in the classroom. So they subjected basically these videos where they showed a child in a schoolyard, which was like top notch, it's a private school, right, clean, monkey barging, awesome, someone like playing, right, really great. And then they showed this other image of basically the opposite, a deep down school, same child, deep down school, right, doesn't really look good, bad socioeconomic context, right? And then they asked, okay, what would the scores of these students be on math, English, blah, 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 even though they knew nothing about it, they just knew the image. And in fact, they always scored the child from the poorer setting, right, more poorly on their scores. That's a preconceived notion. It's a stereotype, right? And then they showed half of them their test scores. But what was cool is that they showed, okay, this child has this test score, but they basically just randomly did correct and incorrect answers. It was 50-50, right? Of that child versus the other child. And again, they scored them even more worse in terms of what they thought that how good they would do in school, right? A confirmation bias. See that evidence in a way based on their preconceived notion of the stereotype. So I just took that simple design and applied it exactly to the question of non-native species. All right? So I basically set up my subjects into two treatments. One is an expectation treatment. I basically showed them this video. This is really horrible dialogue of me talking in the background. I'm describing a generic forest and how the public is interested in this plant that is in this forest. And then just talked about how, again, no directionality, just like we're really interested in the nature, what role the species might play in this new environment. And the two treatments with one was basically we said was non-native, and the other one we said was native, right? So that's kind of the first expectation. We have a positive expectation if we call it native, versus a negative expectation if we call it non-native. I mean, that's kind of the first we check the teachers, right? Looking at the two videos. Then half of those subjects basically watched a 5-minute video describing 6 hypothetical scientific studies. This basically provided data in the form of what is the effect or the of that target species, which they had in mind either being native or non-native, right, on basically plants, animals, ecosystem processes. But importantly, this data was completely inclusive. It had no pattern. It was random. This is the density of the focal species, and this is invertebrate density, and that is a correlation of 0. This is the growth of the focal species and 3 other resident species, and you can see it is the average of those 3. Right? So again, providing evidence which actually helps you in no way actually assess the status of the likely impact of that species. Okay, how's that sound? Cool, I'm having fun. Okay. So here's the 2 trials, right? They either got an expectancy treatment, the video, positive or negative, whether they just said it was native or non-native. And then we have this, right, so that's and then a performance treatment. Either they got none, they didn't get the data, they just saw the video and answered some questions, or they got data and was completely neutral. And what we call that is the performance treatment for the performance of the species. These hypotheses, basically these 2 treatments test these 2 hypotheses, and then ask a whole bunch of questions. I can't show them all to you, but basically one of them was like, what ecological effects does this species have? From negative to positive, a Likert scale from 0 to 5. You know, what effects does that on plants, ecosystems? And then I also said, what management action should you use? Should you eradicate it right away? And all of these things. Okay? All right, so here's some of the results. I got to take a drink. I'm getting excited. Here are the ecological effects. So here's the mean and variation among the treatment pools, got a pretty good sample size. Here's negative, neutral, and positive. This is the negative expectancy for non-natives, and this is native. Again, they've just seen the video, that's it. Okay? On average, those which were called non-native, even given no other information, were significantly different from neutral. So those ecologists, those scientists basically said that that species, just from watching the video, has a strong negative effect in that ecosystem. Whereas native species are actually closer to somewhat positive, again, significantly different. So there's, again, general tendency to kind of maybe discount the value of a non-native when given just that information. Now, if we separate ecologists from invasive species, invasive biologists, right here. So these same bars, but I'm now just split up those 2 populations, and you can see invasion biologists, and I haven't shown the stats here, it's a public lecture, significantly different in terms of a greater negative perception on non-native species by invasion biologists compared to ecologists. No difference in terms of native species. Okay, so stereotype, this is now asking some questions about management. So 1, should we try to reduce the threats to that focal species? So in general, you would not reduce the threats. And the general idea is that you agree with that. So you wouldn't want to reduce the threats to non-natives, but you would for natives. Immediately eradicate non-natives compared to natives. Educational campaign, yes, right away. And then actually some kind of little difference in terms of devoting resources. So again, the separation between the perceived notion of a non-native and the actual data provided to the contrary. Real quick, this is then the second part, the confirmation bias. So what I've shown here is this is the performance treatment. So they were provided data versus not. So yes data versus not. And this is the native species versus non-native species expectation. So what we see, this is the result I showed you previously in terms of the difference between the two groups when they're given no data. And what you can see is that there's some course correction here. So what, right? So when provided the data, which showed actually no effect of the species, generally they were considered more neutral. Okay? And native species, which are always positive, right? Suddenly came down to neutral and data was provided to them. So it's actually quite nice. That actually there's little evidence of a confirmation bias here when presented some data. Okay? Now that's still significantly different than neutral, but not as bad as it used to be. And what we see is that if we just look at this non-native species here, and we separate ecologists from invasion biologists, in general, though, what's interesting is that ecologists didn't change their mind at all. But those maybe that are somewhat more informed of invasive species, the invasion biologists, actually made a big course correction. Okay? Okay, so what's the take-home message here? Native status here might invoke potential stereotypes among ecologists. And that these forces that promote these systematic biases that I showed, which varied among target groups, should be carefully considered as scientists kind of move forward in this debate and move forward in terms of the way in which we think about these species. And really, consciousness raising is a super powerful approach to get rid of stereotypes, right? Gender stereotypes, racial, cultural stereotypes. Consciousness awareness is the one tool reveals those stereotypes to try to minimize them in the future. And I think we just need to be a bit more aware of these. Okay, but these kind of stereotypes are actually also invoked in the way in which terminology that we use. We use kind of real military language, routinely pops up in the literature. We use terms like battle and harm and destroy when we're talking about, or meltdown when we talk about invasive species. So we see images such as this, invasion of the flying fish, the deadly bees, right? And the policy and management efforts of invasive species often then really invoke these emotional responses as much as they do in terms of the analysis of facts. So although jargon and terminology is useful for some things, imagine the battle, or the war on cancer, right? Good British terminology, which really subsumed a lot of things. Messaging is super important, right? Martin Luther King didn't get up in 1963 and reach out there and tell everyone that he had a nightmare. He had a dream. No matter how bad it was, he focused on the good. How do we create the good? How do we envision the good? And I would argue that a similar thing should occur when we're thinking about non-native species. I'm not promoting the introduction of non-native species or invasive species, but I'm thinking about having a broader lens on the way in which we talk about them, particularly among the public. So we see lots of these headlines, right? Voracious quagga mussels gobbling things up, or weed wars. Look at this, Maryland has become ground zero for a new invasion. Right? Things that invoke emotion and therefore invoke biases in terms of the way in which we might information. Okay, so one way that we kind of think about maybe envisioning what the future might look like is this whole idea of using scenario planning. So invasions are very contingent on so many different drivers. They're really tough to predict. And scenario-based projections are widely used to try to understand or encapsulate that uncertainty and communicate it to broader audiences. So in fact, when uncertainty is high and your controllability is low, scenario planning has a very large role to play. And we can think scenario planning had played a really huge role in terms of community building in South Africa, in terms of how Shell weathered the oil crisis in the 70s. And then we can think about the Manelian assessment, right? Climate projections. These are all scenario-based approaches. So what I want to do today is talk a little bit about a scenario-based approach in terms of how we envision non-native species. So what I've shown here is just this kind of trade-off, if you will, between the way in which we might treat or envision non-native species in the future. Either we'll collectively act against them, or embrace them, or we'll act more locally. We'll be more proactive in terms of the way in which we think we want to use them or prevent them, versus reactive, control, things that we've done in the past. So I'm going to talk real briefly just about these four corners. And then there's going to be some truth that resonates in each one of these corners. And then we can all think amongst ourselves about where we might want to envision the future when it comes to how non-native species are perceived and used. So obviously this New World Order is kind of one extreme example. This is kind of governed by the forces that have really dominated the issue to date. We're talking about the openness of borders, growth of countries. Trade is very, very important, and with that comes the risk of invasion. And maybe our borders will be so open and invasive species and non-native species will move around so much that this distinction between native and non-native might become irrelevant in the future. Right? There's this, and so we know we're seeing this right now, a huge risk of invasion from trade, whether it's airline traffic shown here. I was on one of these flights last night. Right? The connectedness of the internet and e-commerce, where you can get shipped to your door a non-native species in 24 hours. Okay? For example, 3 billion live organisms were legally imported into the US last year. And the large majority of these were not identified properly. So let me be the first to introduce you to the new Pangea. Welcome aboard, right? George Orwell had it great. Some animals are more equal than others. In many ways, we are homogenizing the world through the openness of our borders. You know, one really great example is, because I can blame where I'm living right now, is the rainbow trout, right? This species, these are the over 90 species globally in which this species has been introduced to, right? So species have been moved around all over the place, mainly through intentional introduction. This is just a little spaghetti diagram. I love these, really, especially late at night. The general fact is the width of these are just the number of species that are getting moved between different continents of the world. The thicker they are, the more species, and there's a lot of species that are getting moved within continents. So the simple fact I want to make here is that we're all super connected, and there's a lot of movement of different organisms. And in fact, we've seen this global homogenization. This is some work that I did looking at homogenization, or the similarity of fish faunas over time. On average, countries now across the world share about 4 additional species in common than they did based on just their native fauna. So two countries which historically had no species in common, the US and Singapore, which kind of makes sense, now have 33 species in common. Or the UK and Argentina, I'm trying to take extremes here. Sweden and Zimbabwe, last time I checked environmentally, they're not that similar, right? Now have about 8 species in common. So naturally, this is the amount of shared species between, say, the US and Norway. The numbers are more impressive for the US. I'm sorry I didn't show Canada. I really wanted to, but they're more impressive for the US. And these are how many species are now shared across those countries. Okay? Uganda, Norway, the United States, and Australia. And it's just not here, right? We're seeing cultural homogenization. We're seeing the loss of endemic languages, by some estimates 200 over the last 50 years alone. Right? English is the dominant spoken language. McDonaldization of the landscape. Kids from Poland eating a Big Mac. Right, so this is a great quote, James Kunstler. If every place is the same, why go anywhere? Right? Super interesting. Okay, the extreme to that is then to actually just fortress in. Basically just say, let's basically turn inwardly the governments from the threats of non-natives, intervene, strong control on what's coming in, blacklist everything, harsh regulatory practices, just shut down our borders, right? It's an extreme. That's what's great about these examples, right? Okay. But these overly protective policies obviously are going to get in the way of free trade, free markets, and they're going to have a whole variety of things, right? Stricter limits on international trade. Again, new regulations, federal regulations to try to stop species from coming in, and a further advancement of this guilty until proven innocent. Anything that's non-native then must be bad, right? Now, I would argue that if we ever get into this fortress world, this is a logical consequence of science's failure to actually predict or forecast the vulnerability of ecosystems to invasion. If we ever get there, I think scientists have not done their job. And it's a tough job. We know we have broken screens with respect to importation rules. They're inefficient and they're often not supported by the law. And the United States is a fantastic example of that. Again, millions of live fish come into the US. The majority of them are not correctly identified. For example, this is what was in a box of something called tropical fish, right? I don't know, right? And again, it's not that the inspections, obviously, it's a big challenge. Think about the sheer amount of things that are coming across our border, right? But we need to be able to do better. Okay, we also do what we call chasing the invader ambulance. Ecologists do a really good job of studying the same species and recreating the same impacts in different geographic locations. We know a lot about a very small number of invasive species. And we need to do better about better understanding the gradation upon which non-natives might have impacts. These are some examples of who have received a lot of attention. Some rightly so because of their impacts, but I think we need to broaden our portfolio a little bit. Now, the extreme over here in terms of being proactive but operating at large scales is what we call an engineered world. So we basically engineer the world, heavily manage it to deliver goods and services. So these are going to be basically market-based incentives, technology to achieve solutions to environmental problems that actively use non-native species in a proactive way. And again, there's some truth of this, right? This can involve exploiting invasive species. We do that already. I'm going to talk a little bit about these other things, which would be really hands-on ways in which we're using non-native species. Right? So one is in harvesting non-natives. Right? There's a debate going on. Can we actually harvest invaders for bioethanol? I'm just going to stop there. Taxon substitution is another really good strategy that's basically getting used, in which non-native species are intentionally getting introduced into habitats which provide the ecological role formerly played by natives. So for example, if you think about giant tortoises on islands which have gone extinct, and then basically the introduction of a very similar tortoise species which provides the same ecological role, but yet can thrive in those altered environments. There's this idea of assisted colonization, right? Actively moving individuals and species around ahead of their climate requirements. They naturally can't get there, so they're going to pick them up and move them poleward or northward. This is a great cartoon by Emma Maris. Unfortunately, she got it slightly backwards. She's dropping off polar bears in the desert. It's actually the other way around, right? Camels, right? But the simple point is right? Moving things around. Now, there's a healthy debate about the pros and cons of moving species around, but again, this is just an active example of kind of engineering systems and playing a more heavy-handed role in what we want to do. And scientists are playing a leading role in terms of trying to talk about this debate, reframe it, and think about strategy. And then ultimately, there's just engineering entire ecosystems. Well, of course, we are already doing this across the landscape, but doing it in a more active role which embraces the potential positive roles of non-native species. And then finally, it's just this bottom kind of aspect in which we are proactive but acting at very local scales. I call this the management mosaic. This is this idea of having very asynchronous types of management procedures at different small scales scattered across large regions. The idea that for resource managers and the general public and their actions in one location impact, obviously, the invasion potential of other locations. This is essentially a weakest link issue. So in the United States, it's super proud of this. It's like each state has a different aquatic invasive species management plan. Some have plans, some don't. Some are comprehensive and include aquatics, some don't. It's just patchwork, and obviously species don't obey political boundaries. You're only as strong as your weakest link. What's really exciting in Canada is that just this year, Fisheries and Ocean basically announced a very comprehensive national scale plan for basically merging and putting all the province and territory invasive species action plans together on common footing to try to eliminate that weakest link. And the United States could learn a lot from that. And the reason is that actions in one place really affect others. So for example, there's millions of dollars spent on ripping out Eurasian milfoil, only for the very next summer for it to get reinvaded on a prop from a lake just a mile away that has it. Right? Mismatches. There's Montana reservoirs in which we're rote knowing them that kill pike, right? And then fishermen are moving them in through our bait bucket. There's mismatches, challenges that we need to deal with. So I guess my question with this a little bit is that how useful are these very grassroots efforts to eradicate or control species at very local levels? We have an engaged public which love to rip out ivy, right? Or knotweed. We have an engaged federal and state government that likes to spray herbicides from helicopters, right? Or road-known lakes. How can these be, basically brought together to have more effective outcome? And there's some of these, and just one example here is that the negative implication or sometimes the collateral damage that this might occur. So citizen-based efforts for control sometimes can have very large unintended consequences. So for example, the removal of exotic prey can increase predation pressure on native prey, right? Removal of exotic plants can reduce availability. And what a really great example for cane toad in Australia, right? That's such a classic example. We got these toad busters going out, right? And they're basically removing and spraying small ponds. And what's happening is that as they tromp through the near shore of these ponds, they're actually disturbing and killing natural parasites, parasites of cane toad, right? So they're doing good to try to kill, but then these natural defenses, these natural parasites, are actually then basically not being effective anymore. Good cause, good idea, but unfortunately, unintended consequences. So I want to finish with this simple idea, and the futuristic literature is very interesting. The trend is not destiny. Here we are today, and as we look to the future, there's any variety of trajectories we can take. It can be any one of these envisioned scenarios, right? And fast forward 50 years from now, it might be a totally different scenario. But the simple fact is that we can think about the past, but it not necessarily defines our future. So I'd argue the future is ours when it comes to non-native species. We're challenged to really reconcile this perception of what non-native means and the perception of what a natural world is with the rapidly changing world that we're seeing in front of us. I would argue that we benefit from what we call a Janus-based approach to invasive species. This Greek god, right, of two faces. You look both forward and backwards, right? His common day namesakes is the month of January, which sort of ends and begins the year, or the janitor, the keeper of hallways and doors. I think it's very important for us to look back at where we've been when we think about moving, but then also not forget to look really far in the future and think about ways in which we can embrace these perceptions, pick those battles to keep out those non-native species that we know of ecological impacts, but better prioritize our views and future management in terms of those beneficial non-natives when we look to the future. And with that, thank you so much.